Welcome to St. John's Cathedral. I met some of you sort of tangentially over next door, but for those of you I didn't get a chance to greet, my name is Jason Overall. I'm the Director of Music here at St. John's, and we are absolutely thrilled that you are celebrating with us tonight. We are in our 175th year, and so we're having sort of a year-long birthday party. This is one of our signature events that we're doing this year. We are really happy to be back in our cathedral space. We spent about a year renovating this building, and you can now see the fruits of all of that labor and hear the fruits of that labor in the very lively acoustic that we have. We thought that there would be no better way to really celebrate our history than to partner with some local folks, some local artisans. And so we have Good Golly Tamale, and we have a very new Knoxville brewery, Albright Grove, next door. But then also we wanted to think about our history as St. John's has evolved right alongside downtown Knoxville. And of course there is no person on earth more capable of talking about the history of Knoxville than our guest tonight, Jack Neely. And he's brought along Jack has also brought along the very popular musician R.B. Morris, who has and as you'll hear tonight, R.B. Morris has a particular interest in the poetry of James Agee, and you'll hear some of those connections with St. John's. So we have a really delightful evening for you planned, and then after this presentation is over, please stick around. There are more tamales and there's more beer, and there's more conversation to be had next door. Jack and RB will both be next door and ready for more conversation. So once we finish here, please make your way back to the Great Hall and spend the evening in conversation and celebrating with us our 175th birthday. So without further ado, let's all welcome again Jack Neely.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Can y'all hear? This is a great treat for me, a great honor to be here on this occasion, and it's a great honor to be on the stage with my old friend R.B. Morris. I think the first time I ever talked to a crowd of strangers was not a Rotary Club luncheon, but a bar about 35 years ago. And R.B. was having a series of poetry readings at different places, and they were usually bars, and sometimes we had permission, and sometimes we didn't. But we'd go in and have a reading in different places, and it was great fun, and it kind of got me used to this public speaking thing early. But I'm not an Episcopalian, and I just want to say that because to prove that I'm not biased in favor of this church, because this church is an extraordinarily historic church in lots of different ways, and I'm much honored to be here. And I think the repast is appropriate this evening. Because we're going to be talking a lot about music in Knoxville history, and believe it or not, both beer and tamales have connection to Knoxville music. Beer's connections is fairly obvious. There were, everybody, when they go to drink beer, they start singing more than they ordinarily do. But the other thing is, tamales, actually, we have a deep tamale culture in Knoxville that goes back to the 1880s. There was a guy named Harry Royston who was a black man who'd been a circus carny, and he started making tamales, and he would sell them in the black part of town. And at night he would come up to Gay Street and he would sell them tamales in the 1880s and 90s to people coming out of Staub's Opera House, which was about a block away from here. And people would be coming out at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, they'd be kind of hungry, get a tamale from a guy with a hand cart. And it was, this is, historians love resonance and the idea of things coming back in a slightly different form. I don't think that Harry had more than one flavor of tamale, but it was. But anyway, like I say, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sometimes persuaded to give walking tours of my hometown, and St. John's Corner always presents a dilemma because it has too many stories for most groups that I'm walking with. Most of them are very interesting. A lot of them are very interesting ones about. Yes. Oh, you can't? Oh, really? Oh, okay. All right. Well, can you hear better now? All right. Oh, yeah. Right next to the mic. Okay. All right. Okay, it might take longer. I resolved that I would tell this story really fast because I have so many stories to tell. But I'll see how it goes. But I was saying I'm sometimes persuaded to give walking tours of downtown, and St. John's Corner is always a challenge because there's so many interesting stories about musicians, authors, and artists especially. And just narrowing it down to the ones of national significance makes it still a rather huge subject. So that's a reason I need to talk sort of fast at least. I'll try to keep it sort of slowish. I guess ministers priests never talk very fast, do they? That's one thing you learn in seminary, perhaps. But anyway, we're celebrating the not this church building, but the original church, which was built in 175 years ago in 1844. I understand that the Episcopalians had some earlier temporary presidents in the 1820s, but we're celebrating 1844, the establishment of this church building on this corner. The original church was in the Gothic style, and we don't know a whole lot about some aspects of it. But one of the early erectors here was a guy named Thomas Humes, and there's never been a more influential person in Knoxville history than Thomas Humes. He had an amazing, remarkable life. He really had 4 different careers, one after another. He was the son of an Irish Presbyterian father, was raised Presbyterian, and he thought he wanted to be a Presbyterian minister. He wanted to be he went to Princeton, the famous Princeton Seminary for Presbyterians, he learned enough about Presbyterianism to realize that he actually wasn't a Presbyterian. So he came back to town kind of befuddled and became, like a lot of befuddled people, became a journalist for a while, and was editor of a few newspapers here in the 1830s and 40s. And during this time, he, like some journalists do by happenstance, he became a historian of the city. And I think the very first time anybody wrote anything about the history of Knoxville was when Thomas Humes gave a talk about the history of Knoxville in 1842. Nobody had really thought about it before. They just set up here, and they started realizing, he started realizing people were dying off, and he needed to nail down these stories while he could, and gave this talk, and it's written down and published. You can read it. But it was the first 50 years of the history of Knoxville, and it's a pretty interesting read, as a lot of stuff he did over the years. But in the 1840s, he began studying with a well-known Episcopal bishop, the very first bishop of Tennessee, named James Odie. If you've ever been to Sewanee, you know there's the Odie Church, the Odie Chapel there. A really interesting, unusual church at Sewanee, which is where he founded a college. He was one of the founders of the University of the South there. The same guy was dealing with Thomas Humes of Knoxville, was teaching him what he knew about the Episcopal faith. But he became, Thomas Humes became the rector of this church in 1846, and served ably for quite a few years. He ran into a problem in 1861 when the city was occupied by the Confederate Army, and they decided that he, being a Unionist pastor of the Episcopal Church, decided he needed to either say nice things about the Confederates from the pulpit or get out, and he got out. But he was invited back 2 years later when General Burnside, the Union general who occupied Knoxville and who happened to be an Episcopalian himself, invited Thomas Humes to come back and reopen St. John's and recommence services here. He did this until he got tapped to be the president of what was then called East Tennessee University, a tiny little college on a hill that had, maybe 100 students or so, very small college. And he saw it grow in the 1860s, 70s, and early 80s. He was there throughout its kind of this major growth era, when the university was claimed the Moral Act status that made it different from all other public universities in the South, and eventually led to it becoming the University of Tennessee, which might otherwise have seemed unlikely. But he definitely played, I think, Republican politics, and made sure that this was going to be the University of Tennessee. Had some issues with them after that, though, and he worked several years as a university administrator. Finally retired. About the time he retired, he left to he wrote a book called The Loyal Mountaineers of Tennessee, which is one of the best books written about the Civil War in East Tennessee. I mean, I think it's the single best book about the Civil War in East Tennessee, written by someone who actually witnessed it. He had a really good hand as a former journalist. He had a good hand with a pen, and wrote this really fascinating first-hand account of the war, and it leaves us many stories we wouldn't have known about, like the fascinating story of the death and burial of General Sanders because of Thomas Humes. But once he retired as UT president, he didn't move to Florida. He became our first full-time librarian. When they first opened Lost McGee Library on Gay Street, the original location, it was Thomas Humes, humbly, after having been an Episcopal priest and a university president, he was the one who found the books for you. So he had a really worthy life in lots and lots of ways. A lot of the early members of this church were English immigrants, as you might expect, with the source of the Episcopal Church is in England. Some of them were interesting people like Joseph Wood, who was a watchmaker who wound up here and began a long family tradition with his church. I'll talk more about him later. But other English immigrants include the Hodgson family, who came here just at the very end of the Civil War. The widow Eliza Hodgson and her children from Manchester, England, were here. They were once an affluent upper middle class family in Manchester, but they'd lost their textile business as a result of the cotton supply crisis during the Civil War. It's amazing how the American Civil War had such big impact in Great Britain, but it did. They lost their jobs. They were suddenly poor, and Eliza heard about her brother had been bragging about how great he was doing in America, and she said, "Great, we'll come move in with you." And she brought her kids and arrived here in Knoxville, where he was doing great in the dry goods business, or so he'd been telling them in letters. And it turned out that he was not quite as prosperous as he had claimed, and they were again in kind of a bind. This sounds like a story by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And in fact, one of Eliza Hodgson's children turned out to be Frances Hodgson Burnett. They were all members of this church. Of course, Frances Hodgson Burnett, later known as for Little Lord Fauntleroy and The Secret Garden and A Little Princess, one of the most popular and successful fiction writers of her time, was a member of this church for about 10 years at least. She got the Burnett from a local doctor that she married, a guy from Newmarket. But she lived here in Knoxville from about 1866 to 1875 and began her very successful writing career as a teenage St. John's parishioner. Many of her stories are set in her native England, like The Secret Garden, but she wrote one book which seems to be based on Knoxville. I mean, pretty obviously based on Knoxville. It's based on a very thinly described Knoxville, a rough-edged town at the end of badly battle-scarred in Tennessee called Delisleville. Let me read this piece. This is, by the way, not one of her better-known books. It's always listed among her works, but this is literally the only copy of this book I've ever seen, and it's from the library next door. I'm sure there's some out there on the internet, but she's describing Delisleville. The sentiments of Delisleville were purely patrician. It was the county town and contained 6,000 inhabitants, which was Knoxville's population roughly at the end of the Civil War, 2 hotels and a courthouse. It had also 2 or 3 business streets and half a dozen churches, all very much at odds with each other, and each seriously inclined to disbelieve in the probable salvation of the rest. The first families, of which there were 8 or 10 with numerous branches, attended the Episcopal Church. The second best, the Presbyterian, while the inferior classes, who could scarcely be counted at all, since they had not been born in Delisleville, drifted to the Methodists. The DeWilloughbys, and this is the family that she's writing about, attended the Episcopal Church. And being generally endowed with voices, 2 or 3 of them sang in the choir, which was composed entirely of members of the attending families, and executed most difficult music in a manner which was the cause, after each service, of much divided opinion. Opinion was divided because the choir was divided, separated, in fact, into several small select cliques, each engaged in deadly and bitter feud with the rest. When the moon-eyed soprano arose with a gentle flutter and opened her charming mouth in solo, her friends settled themselves in their pews with a general rustle of satisfaction, while the friends of the contralto exchanged civilly significant glances. And on the way home, the solo in question was disposed of in a manner at once thorough and final. The same thing occurred when the contralto was prominent, or the tenor, or the baritone, or the basso, each of whom it was confidently asserted by competent Delisleville judges might have rendered him or herself and Delisleville immortal upon the lyric stage if social position had not placed the following of such a profession entirely out of the question. Anyway, I thought you might enjoy that. That's called In Connection with the DeWilloughby Claim. Anyway, she left town in the mid-1870s. And by the way, she later also wrote a memoir of Knoxville, a very unusual book called The One I Knew the Best of All. She does not use the word Knoxville in the entire book. The book is actually, as I understand, being reprinted here in the region, and I hope will be available very soon. I hope so, because I wrote the introduction to it. But it's a fascinating book. You have to read between the lines to tell what she's talking about. But after you get the swing of it, I think people will be quoting this book because she describes so many things wonderfully. The view of the mountains from here, for example. Anyway, I'm not going to talk very much about politics, but I can't avoid one subject in particular. It's interesting that after Parson Brownlow, in the whole 50 years since Parson Brownlow was governor, we've had only 2 governors from Knoxville proper in the whole history of Tennessee. Both were associated with this church in their youth in very different ways. One of them I knew very well. His name was Bill Haslam, and I bet a lot of you know him well. He grew up in this church. But his childhood was very different from that of Ben Hooper, who I'll be talking about. Ben Hooper was born Ben Wade, W-A-D-E, out of wedlock in Cocke County, and ended up with his single mother in Knoxville, living in the dangerous Bowery, the cheapest part of town, where Knoxville's poorest black and white and immigrant lived. He learned how to fight from the Irish who lived down on the Bowery. After 2 years of living on the edge and deciding this was just not any way for a mother to raise her child, her mother very sadly came to St. John's and asked if they could find a place for him in their relatively new orphanage, the St. John's Orphanage. It had been founded in 1873, they say, as an offshoot of the St. John's Sewing Circle. Women would get together and sew, and they decided, gosh, why don't we have an orphanage here? And it was led at the time by a woman named Mary Richardson. The orphanage, by the way, was not right here. It was down on Henley Street. I think it was near where Chesapeake's is now. But it was part of the deal with the orphanage that they would take care of you, they would teach you things. Ben Hooper was impressed with how they taught him to be organized. But one thing was mandatory, and that was attendance in this church every Sunday. It was a weekly requirement to come here to Sunday school and church. He wrote an autobiography that I recommend. It's called The Unwanted Boy. Can you imagine a governor writing his autobiography, and it's The Unwanted Boy, but it's unlike any other political autobiography I've ever read. He said in there, of all the moves made by, or rather for, my unwanted self, this was quite the best. And he's talking about his mother's choice to bring him to St. John's Orphanage. He was later adopted from St. John's by his birth father, a physician who had declined to marry his mother. But it gets more complicated after that. But anyway, his time at the St. John's orphanage was a high point of his youth. He was elected governor in 1910, served a 4-year term, and is generally well remembered. He was gone by the time what I assume was the most violent episode in the history of the church. I wonder how many people have heard of this. There was a guy named member of this church who was a member of the choir named Jim Rule. He was a newspaper man, worked for the old journal that was run by his father, William Rule. His father was one of the most admirable people in Knoxville history in some ways. He was kind of introduced the idea of objective journalism to the city. But he was not he was a Methodist. His son, for his reasons of his own, was an Episcopalian. But in early 1888, Jim Rule and/or his father were alleged to have been associated with a ghost-written column that made certain people very angry. It was signed only XYZ. It was called the XYZ column. And it was harshly critical of the city physician, the public physician that was hired by the mayor, and they thought there was a lot of cronyism at foot, and they called him incompetent and overpaid in this column. This physician's sons, John West, another one, and another guy, were determined to seek revenge for this insult in the paper. And just writing another letter to the editor was not enough for them. They wanted someone to shed blood over this. They actually greeted Jim Rule had a habit of, he lived in Fort Sanders, but he walked all the way to church on a Sunday morning with his wife, and was walking to church, dressed for church, was carrying a roll of music to sing in the choir, when he saw these guys waiting for him, and they kind of ambushed him. John West and two cronies confronted Rule as he walked toward the front door. Rule, of course, this being Knoxville in the 1880s, even if you're walking to church to sing in the choir, you're armed. He pulled a gun on them. He realized what they were up to, that they meant him no good, and he backed up from them. He was trying to just keep his eye on them, and backed up on them and tripped over a horse rack, and and apparently the gun went off, and at that point may have hit one of the other guys. It's hard to tell what happened exactly next, but as soon as he fell, these three guys jumped on him. They stabbed him, bludgeoned, and shot him as he lay on the ground. The church, which had just begun its services, emptied out, and they looked out and saw Rule covered with blood, lying on the sidewalk, and people were very surprised when he stood up and said, "I'm not as badly hurt as you think I am." The doctors examined him, though, and found he had 7 knife wounds, 12 lacerations to his scalp, and a bullet wound in his arm. However, he had shot 2 of his assailants in this mishap, and John West later died without confessing, even though they kept interrogating him as he died, that he had attacked Rule. Another was wounded. Rule was charged with murder and stood trial, but was acquitted. Anyway, journalism and sometimes even singing in the choir can be dangerous, so be careful. But all that happened in the old church that was here before they built this one. By the way, only one photograph is known of that old church, unless someone has found another one recently. It was a structure, and it's a frustrating photograph because I love sidewalk trees, but in the summertime they completely obliterate architecture, and that's the case with this picture. You can hardly see anything of this church, and it's our only picture of it. Lucy Templeton, the daring columnist who was a member of this church, I wonder if someone here might have known her. I don't think anybody here looks old enough to have known Lucy Templeton, but she was an amazing woman. Reading her old columns is a gratifying experience if you get a chance to read them on Papers to Pixels. But she was the only columnist in Knoxville. After John Gunther said, "This is the ugliest city in America," Lucy Templeton was the only one who said, "Of course it is. I've been saying this for years and nobody listens to me." But anyway, Lucy Templeton, though, was fascinated with this photograph of the old church, and believed it was taken by Charles Christopher Crouch, the former parishioner who was an artist, born in 1849, arguably Knoxville's first professional painter. They called him the Corot of the South. He was best known for his depictions of the Smoky Mountains. And these paintings that he painted were not just beautiful, they served a big purpose for Knoxville because, believe it or not, in the 1880s and 90s, when he was painting these pictures of the mountains, few Knoxvillians had seen the Smoky Mountains up close. It was easier to get to New York than it was to get to the Smoky Mountains because New York was, you get on a train and get off the train and you're in New York, but the Smokies were not like that. It usually took some trespassing and some camping out on the way to even get close to the mountains. But he brought back these fascinating pictures of the Smokies, and people bought them and became pretty well known for them. But Crouch was also a musician, and at least occasionally was the organist at this church. He was later more associated with St. James, but his family was connected to this church. And by the way, if you go outside my organization, the Knoxville History Project, we have a series of art wraps, and we have an art wrap about Charles Crouch on the opposite side of the street, right on the corner, just across the way there, that kind of tells his story and has one of his paintings there. But he was born into a very unusual family. His mother, they were from Germany. His mother was from a minor nobility. Her name was Emma von Wirsing. His father was her music teacher, Emil Crouch, and he had several more consonants in the original name than the ones you see in the Crouch Park, which is named for the family. They immigrated during an era that is really interesting and is surprisingly left out of a lot of histories of Knoxville, the great German immigration from the German revolutions in the 1840s. Refugees, more than 1 million refugees came to America looking just to get away from the horror that was in the so-called in Germany during the so-called Spring of Nations. It was kind of like the Arab Spring in Europe in a way, that things looked like they were going to be great and then they were worse than they had been before. But it was, this changed Knoxville in many, many ways. It introduced a lot of things to bring back the subject, the relevance of beer. It introduced beer to us. We didn't have beer much in Knoxville before the Germans arrived from Germany. We didn't have Christmas trees. And we didn't have classical music. I'll be talking about that in just a minute. But anyway, they were an astonishingly creative and kind of eccentric family. They were better off than a lot of immigrants and were able to live in a big house on East Hill Avenue. Not just any big house, it was a kind of a fascinating place, it sounds like. They lived with a lot of exotic pets, tropical birds in the house that sometimes went free inside the house. They had lots of art on the walls. They had music constantly. Everybody played an instrument in the Crouch family. Very musical, very artistic, and very eccentric family. They were astonishingly creative. I'll get more into them in a little bit. But there's another especially interesting German family in town, and I wonder why so many Germans in the St. John's Church, which is associated with England, is a good question. And I think possibly the draw was the music. From an early era, this church had a reputation for excellence in music. But one of the most interesting, most interesting one was a guy named Gustavus Knabe, or Knabe as some people pronounce it, K-N-A-B-E. He was born in 1817 in Leipzig, in the country then known as Saxony. Leipzig, of course, was the home of Bach, and it was the home of lots of musicians in the 1820s and 30s. In fact, Gustavus Knabe performed in Mendelssohn's famous orchestra in Germany. He knew Wagner, but he actually was not as fond of him as he was of the Schumanns, Robert and Clara Schumann. He was good friends of theirs. But he was compelled for reasons of his own to come to America, and actually learned on the way to America that Felix Mendelssohn had died. He came with his wife Matilda, by the way, whose father had been a captain on the staff of the King of Württemberg. But one reason Knoxville got lots of educated German refugees was because of a place that they called Wartburg, that we called Wartburg. That was a kind of a German refugee camp in a way. They received all these refugees from the German revolutions. And sort of a German colony. But many got there in this beautiful place in the Cumberland Mountains and realized after the first winter, perhaps, that they weren't ready for that rugged life and migrated to Knoxville. This describes a lot of people, the Naffel family, and lots of people came through Wartburg. But this was, interestingly, for the Kanawha, this was a hilly, landlocked river town, neither a village nor a big city, and it was perhaps not completely unlike Leipzig at the time. And he thought perhaps this could have a place that could have a musical destiny. He happened to be here when the Civil War came along. He joined the Union Army and became the music director with the Ohio 2nd Heavy Artillery, and had a little band that would play rousing things for the soldiers. But after the war, he landed in Knoxville about 1864, I think before the war was properly over, and founded something that he called the Knoxville Philharmonic, which was a choral group with probably a smallish orchestra, but he was involved in all sorts of things. There was enough Germans here to have a German organization called the Turnverein, which was kind of like a big fraternity of German immigrants, and he was the music director for them as well. And in 1871, after he'd been here for several years, he became a professor of music at UT. And led a cornet band, among other things, at UT, just kind of as a side project. The cornet band traveled and got some attention outside of Knoxville, and it's today seen as the forerunner of the Pride of the Southland marching band, which actually his son had more to do with putting together later on. But he founded in 1873 Kanawha's Musical Academy. Several of his children were involved in this. Pauline and Elizabeth, all of his kids were accomplished musicians. But he loved Knoxville, and again, I wonder if there's something about it that reminded him of Leipzig. He wrote a piece. It was mainly known as a conductor and a musician, but he composed some too, and he wrote a piece called "Have You Seen the Roses Blooming?" which was his tribute to his adopted hometown. He became involved in the annual music festival of the 1880s that brought such major classical music and opera figures to Knoxville every spring for several years, like from Emma Juch, the famous German soprano, Victor Herbert, the composer, came here for these things. The Boston Symphony even came here for a Knoxville music festival. But he had a rather large family, all associated with his church, and they were all, as I say, musicians. But among his many pupils was a guy named Frank Nelson, who was an old family Knoxvillian who became a protege of Kanawha, so enamored of Kanawha that he actually went to Leipzig himself to study music there before he came back and to be a music teacher. He wasn't instantly an Episcopalian, actually was the music director at the Presbyterian Church for a couple of years before coming here. But he was, we'll talk more about him later. He was a major figure in the history of this church. But I love to think that Kanawha must have met a young woman who moved here about 3 years before he died, named Bertha Roth, who was later known as Bertha Walburn Clark, who founded the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra in the 1930s. But I know she had Episcopal connections. By the way, the KSO, when I did the Tennessee Theater book, I found out the first time the KSO ever did a concert at the Tennessee Theater was for a benefit for St. John's Orphanage in 1936. But anyway, Kanawha was known in his time for funeral marches, and he was very proud of his funeral marches. There's one in particular that I've never heard this before today, and I think this may be the first time this century that this has been performed in public. But Jason is going to play a piece of Gustavus Kanawha's funeral march for Andrew Johnson, This was performed at the funeral in Greenville, Tennessee, upon Johnson's death in 1875. And it's got an odd little phrase in it that struck Jason as being kind of funny, that it has a similarity to something written about 80 years later by Lerner and Lowe called "Get Me to the Church on Time." But see if you can hear the little bit of it. It takes a little bit of imagination. But Jason, are you over there? All right, thanks a lot, Jim. I want to thank Jason for making that possible, and also Melissa at the library for helping me track that sheet music down. But it's that piece was played in this room in 1906 for the funeral of Gustavus Canaba himself. He died at quite an old age. I think he had far outlived all the people he'd known in Leipzig, Wagner and Mendelssohn and the Schumanns. But to think that a guy that knew them in Leipzig had his funeral in this room makes it unlike any other room in Tennessee, certainly. But all that happened in this church proper, this actual building. This was designed by Joseph Yost, architect from Southern Ohio, who worked heavily in stone between 1880 and 1905. If you see his other work, it bears a family resemblance to to this church. Nothing looks just like this church, but you can see the Yost touch in other buildings. He's best known for his work in Ohio, especially Columbus and Toledo. This is his southernmost work, as far as I know. He never came this far south to do anything else. Anyway, by the time this building opened, the Crouches and the Canabas were longtime members already. Lou Crouch was a piano teacher. By then, her brother Oscar Crouch had studied music at the New England Conservatory in Boston, and he'd come back to his hometown to teach here. He was apparently here for quite a long time. Ended up in Washington, though. But also Charles Christopher Crouch, I mentioned earlier, the only Crouch to marry and have children, the only one who really seemed to have an ordinary life was Edward Crouch. He was a longtime pharmaceutical executive, worked for Sandwich Chamberlain and Albers, and he's the only Crouch who, as creative as they were not procreative. And Edward Crouch, the only non-artist among them, was the only one who had any kids, and he had his kids were Charlie and Joseph. Charlie was became born in 1890. Some of you may remember him. He lived in Westmoreland. He became a TVA photographer. He made such an art of it. His dramatic photographs of new dams and powerhouses, these really amazing things. Being built by TVA, that they were displayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York about 1940. He died in 1981 and surprised the city with $1 million endowment for a park, which is something the city had always been bemoaning, the fact that it didn't have a downtown park, but he made it possible. His brother, Joseph Wood Crouch, is better known. He was born in late 1893, just months after this church was finished. He was named for his grandfather, who I mentioned briefly earlier, the English immigrant Joseph Wood, but he was one of the early parishioners of St. John's. Joseph Wood Crouch was an extraordinarily bright kid, got in trouble at UT over censorship issues in 1915. He was trying to write something in the newspaper that the administration didn't like, and it actually wasn't his last tangling with the UT administration. He, 10 years later, came back to write about the Scopes trial in Dayton and could not get the president of UT at the time, Mr. Morgan, who was actually from Canada, but to denounce the anti-evolution laws in the state. And he wrote this article in the national magazine, the Nation magazine, called "Tennessee, Where Cowards Rule." And it's a tough thing to read, but I don't have any doubt that the things he quotes were accurate. He later became better known in New York for drama criticism, biographies, and books of philosophy. He wrote a book called The Modern Temper, which was rather controversial in 1929. Also became a professor of English at Columbia University, where he got his PhD. In his late 50s, though, he had some health problems and had a complete shift of focus. He moved to Arizona because of his health problems and became fascinated with nature, with the nature of the desert, and began writing about the desert and became a pioneer environmentalist writer, kind of unexpectedly to anyone who had known him in a tuxedo at the New York on Fifth Avenue or Broadway in New York. That this guy became a kind of a desert rat, writing about cactuses and lizards and things, and finding them completely fascinating. And he turned completely to the subject of nature and became much admired by environmentalist writers, like younger ones, like Edward Abbey was a great fan of Joseph Wood Crouch. In the 1960s, he was arguably the most famous writer from Knoxville. This was before people had begun rediscovering James Agee. But today, there are a few quotes from Joseph Wood Crouch's nature writing around the corner of his brother Charlie Crouch's park, but we don't really hear him quoted quite as much as we used to. It's amazing to look back at magazines in the 1940s, 50s, 60s and see how often this guy's quoted. He's just not quoted as much as he used to be. Anyway, most of the Crouches, I say, never married, and the last two did marry. Joseph and Charles did get married, but they didn't have any children. So as far as I know, this large and lively German family of the 1840s and 50s and 60s have no descendants on this planet that I know of, at least. But there was another, a lesser-known family involved here about the same time the Crouches were. In fact, I have reason to believe this guy knew Charlie Crouch. They were both in a YMCA class in the 1890s. His name was Harry McClintock. He was born in 1882 and was in Knoxville until about 1900. Some say he left earlier, but I've found evidence that he was still here then. His father was a railroad and theatrical carpenter. We may forget that in the 1880s and 90s, we were building Pullman cars, style cars here in Knoxville. And you need carpenters to build the cabinets on the inside of the cars. But Mr. McClintock did this sort of thing. He also built coffins and that sort of thing. But he also built sets for Staub's Opera House. Staub's Opera House was open almost every night. It was a block and a half away from here. And they had big vaudeville shows, and they would put up sets quickly. They would be up for just 3 days or so, and then they'd tear them all down. But he got some extra work doing this kind of work. But he was up working on the proscenium above the set and fell and was killed in the theater, leaving and he wasn't making that much money to begin with, and leaving his family in desperate straits. But young Harry, who had gotten fascinated with theater anyway, had according to some accounts, had done some performing here in town as a teenager. But he, as soon as he realized that his father could no longer take care of him, he joined the circus and ran away from home, joined the circus, went to sea for a while. It sounded like he did all of the childhood dreams and almost one after the other. He went to South Africa, was over there during the Boer War, was actually helping some of the mercenaries over there, but and then ended up in China during the Boxer Rebellion right after that. But then he was back in America as kind of a cowboy hobo, and he in the 1920s began strumming his guitar all this time and writing songs, and he popularized a song that may have been, some people say he wrote it, some people say someone else wrote it, but called Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. But he kind of very much identified with the working class, even if he didn't work that much himself. But he was a member of the International Workers of the World, one of the most radical organizations of the era. And very much unlike most Episcopalians from Knoxville, I suppose. But he was kind of an outlier in some ways, off the grid of Knoxville's country music heritage, because he was really he left town before radio and even before the obscure early train station buskers that some scholars have claimed were the first professional country musicians. When he died, it was during the folk music revival of the 1950s, and which had elicited a new respect for him on the West Coast where he'd been living. But here in 1957, when the news of the death was announced, that the newspaper could have found only one person who'd remembered him being here 60 years earlier. But we're fortunate tonight to have my good friend R.B. Morris, and is going to be performing his single best known work, which is called Big Rock Candy Mountain. This was a hit he made in 1928 to begin with. R.B.?
This is a hobo song. One evening as the sun went down and the jungle fires were burning, down the track come a hobo hiking. He said, boys, I'm not turning. I'm going to a place that's far away, beside the crystal fountains. So come with me and you will see the Big Rock Candy Mountain. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, there's a land that's fair and bright, where the handouts grow on bushes and they sleep out every night. and the boxcars are all empty, and the sun shines every day on the birds and the bees and the cigarette trees and the lemonade springs where the bluebirds sing in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. In the Big Rock Candy Mountain, well, the cops have wooden legs, and the bulldogs all have rubber teeth, and the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. And the farmers' trees are full of fruit, the barns are full of hay. Well, I'm bound to go where there ain't no snow, and the rain don't fall, the wind don't blow in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, you never change your socks, and the little streams of alcohol come trickling down the rocks, and the brakemen have to tip their hats, and the railroad bulls are blind. There's a lake of stew and a whiskey too. You can paddle all around in a big canoe in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. In the Big Rock Candy Mountains, the jails are made of tin. You can walk right out as soon as you walk in. And there's no short-handled shovels, no axes, saws, or picks. You can sleep all day, I'm bound to stay, and they hung that jerk who invented work in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. I'll see you all come next fall in the Big Rock Candy Mountain.
Before we did it, but he learned this just for this occasion. A lot of us grew up hearing that song, but I've rarely heard anybody actually sing it in person. That's great. But that was by Harry McClintock, Haywire Mackey they called him, and he was born here in Knoxville and was a member of this church at least for a short time as a kid. But he's remembered, surprisingly. I was surprised to walk out of Elkmont, the brewery on the north side of downtown, and there's a mural with his face on it. He always wore a cowboy hat. The guy in the cowboy hat in the mural that's Harry McClintock from Knoxville. But really fascinating guy. But anyway, I know we're probably running behind, but I want to mention, I mentioned earlier a guy named Frank Nelson, who was one of the proteges of Gustavus Canava, who went to study in Leipzig, just like his idol had, and became the music director of St. John's here in 1896, I think, and held that post for well over half a century. In fact, I think for 60 years or so, an amazing career. As a researcher, I keep running across names, and I think if you had a more distinctive name, I would have noticed this earlier, but I often, in the Victorian era, Frank Nelson, they always talk about things going on at Staub's Opera House, and the soprano was there with her teacher, Frank Nelson. And then I would start noticing things in the 1940s, and Frank Nelson again. And I thought, surely it can't be the same guy, but it is exactly. And it sounds like a fascinating fella. He was music director not just at this church, but of Temple Bethel, the synagogue. So he did kind of moonlighted there, I guess, or Saturday lighted instead of Sunday. But he established the choir, trained lots and lots of professional singers, especially women. Never married. That's kind of a theme with tonight. A lot of these artists, musicians did never marry, but he lived with his sister and just devoted his life to music. But after he came back from Leipzig, he got used to using German terms, and he would start speaking a little bit of German, sometimes confusing people, but he often called his favorite students Fräulein, which they always took as a compliment. But as a young man, he was rather flamboyant. He wore his hair in a pompadour. He had a slight reddish tint to his hair. Was eccentric in several respects. Wore clothes that were just a little bit not exactly out of style, but kind of sideways to style. And was known to drop in offices and leave flowers at the desks of people he liked who'd done something that he appreciated. But my favorite story about him, and some of you may have stories about him that are better, but that he would stop acquaintances on Gay Street. If he just knew you, he would stop you and say, "Good morning. May I please buy you a hat?" And he would literally take someone into the nearest hat store. There were several hat stores downtown at the time, and buy them a hat that fit perfectly, that he thought was great for them. But it was just his little role was to put Knoxville in hats. Lucy Templeton, who I mentioned briefly earlier, the longtime News Sentinel columnist, described, I just happened to run across this early this morning, in 1931, she said, after she came to her desk at the News Sentinel and found a pile of flowers on the desk after she'd written something he liked, she said, "In common with most other people in Knoxville, I am very fond of Frank Nelson. He guided my more or less reluctant fingers through the intricacies of Mendelssohn's Spring Song, flattered me by calling me Fräulein, picked up my music for me once when I was playing Schubert's Serenade at a recital of Miss Lou Crouch's pupils. And for those of us who attend St. Paul's, he is as the cornerstone of the temple." But about the time that he was starting, there was a young guy named Clarence Brown, who was Larkin Brown was a mill runner who came down from Massachusetts to run the old Brookside Mill, and had a family with him. His wife was from Ireland. Larkin Brown was originally from Georgia, but they worked in Massachusetts mostly. But they came here and came to work for Brookside Mills. I had a talk with Gwenda Young, the Irish scholar who just wrote a really thick and good biography of him that was well reviewed by the Wall Street Journal a few months ago. But she was puzzled by something. She said the Browns were Baptists in Massachusetts. How come they were Episcopalians in Tennessee? And I said, well, maybe a Massachusetts Baptist is the same as a Tennessee Episcopalian, but he was a brilliant kid, known for recitations. He would do these long recited things, and I think he was partly assisted by the fact that he was very small, even for his age, and people thought he was even younger than he was, and were just amazed to hear him declaim as he did at the age of 12 or 13, when people thought he was 7 or 8, and would go draw crowds even to Staub's Opera House and churches and so forth. But he was very frequently mentioned in the papers in the first decade of the century. Extremely popular as a performer, often shared a stage with Frank Nelson and his singers. They would often have like a variety show, and they would have little Clarence Brown. But of course, he graduated from UT in engineering in 1910, rather early. He was barely 20 years old at the time. And by 1920, he was in Hollywood making movies for Universal and later for MGM. Prominent in Hollywood for more than 30 years, very successful, credited with discovering Greta Garbo, was one of the first directors to deal with Clark Gable, Joan Crawford, lots of other people. And was the subject, as I say, of a really interesting, thick book. I wish I had more about his time in Knoxville in it than it does, but she has a few pages about Knoxville. But I'll come back to him in just a minute, but I want to mention especially James Agee. This is the guy that this church is literally the only standing architectural remnant of anything that was intimately associated with James Agee in his life. Because we've torn down his birthplace, the house that he lived in Fort Sanders, a lot of things that were associated with Agee. Personally, the movie theater that he and his dad went to was long gone. But this church is still here, and this church was very important to him. He, of course, began as an award-winning poet. was a journalist noted for his documentary work, unmatched in history as far as I know, called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It's a great piece of work, and you need to invest some time in it. But some people say that was the very beginning of new journalism, subjective journalism, that Tom Wolfe and other people began exploiting later. But he was an influential movie critic. There are two collections of his movie criticism, one very recently by UT Press, edited by UT Professor Chuck Mayland, which is, and it's fascinating to read these movies, even if you never see them. You read these reviews, even if you never see the movies. But he was also a screenwriter, nominated for an Oscar for his script for The African Queen. Look for his name next time you see that. He wrote a piece that inspired Samuel Barber's Knoxville Summer 1915. It was one of the things he was best known for in his lifetime. And finally, he was a novelist. His novel, Morning Watch, the only novel finished in his lifetime, was set in Sewanee and has a deeply Episcopal theme. After his father died, his mother eventually moved down to Sewanee, where he went to St. Andrew's School. And of course, after his death, A Death in the Family, his autobiographical novel about his father, won the Pulitzer Prize, as did the Broadway play All the Way Home, on which was based on it. In all, that one story has been made into 4 feature-length films in the last 60 years, including the 1963 theatrical release starring Robert Preston and a 2002 Masterpiece Theater version on PBS, and with John Slattery in the same role played by Robert Preston. But it's remarkable, considering all he did, that James Agee did this and died at the age of 45. His troubled life has been the subject of 3 scholarly biographies now, the first of them published in French, by the way. But the most recent one of them is called Rufus, and it's by Paul Brown, done through UT Press, and it concentrates on the 16 years of his time in Knoxville and Sewanee, basically his Tennessee years and also his family background. But this, as I say, is the only building in town. I probably still our best known writer in some respects that's associated with him very intimately. He was baptized in this room in 1910, on Palm Sunday in 1910. And it's fascinating to imagine who was in this room with him as he was being baptized, because Clarence Brown was a UT student at the time. He was a precocious senior, 19 years old. He might have been here. Agee, by the way, as a film critic, admired Brown's talents, but often thought them wasted on commercial films. I actually found, the Nation magazine always gets us in trouble, but it was in the Nation almost 33 years later that James Agee wrote a review of a movie called The Human Comedy, which some of you may remember from the early 40s. Agee wrote, I have inadequate room left to regret an ill-directed nastiness in my review of The Human Comedy, which should have been more accurately directed. I think of Clarence Brown, who directed it, in the most praiseworthy and respectful terms, as the man who piloted Garbo's best films, and who before that made the excellent and bold films Smoldering Fires and The Signal Tower, those early silent movies. I still have to insist that he has become a dope, and to offer the negligencies of The Human Comedy as proof. But he is a sympathetic and likable casualty. But anyway, you wonder whether they ever met each other, ever knew each other, ever ran across each other here in this room. Another person who might have been there at James Agee's christening in 1910 was Joseph Wood Crouch, who was 16 at the time. And Joseph Wood Crouch was a Fort Sanders neighbor. He lived in Fort Sanders the same time the Agees did. He lived in New York when James Agee did. They both wrote for the Nation magazine about the same time. And I know of no evidence they ever met each other. This is remarkable. They were extremely different in some ways. They both were excelled a lot. They were both very prolific, but they were. Joseph Wood Crouch wrote from his head, and Agee wrote from his heart. That's a really big difference between the two. Crouch never wrote any fiction. Agee loved fiction. But it's fascinating that they never, unless it was in this room, they never met each other. Of course, Crouch was 16 years older. But Agee, known for his lifelong love of music, sang in the choir here. also served as an acolyte in this room and was much influenced by the church, especially Rector Walter Whitaker, whose name you've probably heard before if you're a parishioner here. He was a kind of an intellectual with a love of language that A.G. admired and I think used to great effect. Whitaker, by the way, is mentioned briefly by name in the ostensibly fictional story of Death in the Family. But after A.G.'s father's death about 1919, they went down to St. Andrews at Sewanee, where A.G. lived for a few years, attending school there. He actually came back here, went to Knoxville High for a bit after that. But while he was down at Sewanee, he made a very close friend, an unlikely friend, a generation older than he was, a guy named Father James Fly, F-L-Y-E, was the Episcopal priest down at Sewanee and at St. Andrews. But he became something of a father figure to A.G., who lost his father so suddenly, and probably A.G.'s closest lifelong friend. They began a correspondence when A.G. was just a teenager of 15 years old or so, and it's amazing to read his teenage letters and can you imagine any teenager writing this well at that age? But this correspondence ended only with his death at age 45. In fact, you could say that didn't really end then, because he was, at the time that he died, they found a letter to Father Fly that he had not mailed yet and perhaps not finished yet. But my friend R.B. is going to come back up and read a bit of this letter that he's used for in various purposes. He actually used this in his one-man show about A.G. a few years ago. But R.B. Morris again.
As Jack said, this letter was in the outgoing mail. It was sealed and stamped and on the mantle in the outgoing mail at James A.G.'s house when he died. And it was dated a few days before his death. And the family had gathered there, and I believe it was Father Fly who actually found the letter. And it was included in the book, Letters to Father Fly. So this is one of the last things James A.G. wrote. Dear Father Fly, nothing much to report. I feel in general as if I was dying, a terrible slowing down in every way, above all in relation to work. I've taken 2 weeks to do a job that should have required a week at most, and through it have missed fixing a script in Hollywood which should have paid me twice my ordinary movie salary. However, I'm planning to retreat from money work, use the summer free, and finish my book. The newspaper clip about dogs and cats that you sent in your last letter was startling, to say the least. For a group of men who own racing dogs and who collect cats under the pretense of finding them good homes, only to take them out to be chased by these ravenous dogs and torn apart and devoured, is beyond comment, except my wish to be present, not with an ASPCA badge, but with a machine gun. I'm a little dubious about my desire to kill under such circumstance, but not enough to hesitate in talking. It all connects with a movie idea I've recently had that I'd like to share with you. At the beginning, elephants converge from all over Africa towards a disembodied voice, the voice of God, which addresses them roughly as follows. My beloved children, you know you are my chosen people. You know that to you alone I have given my secret, that I do not regard myself as omnipotent. I gave that up when I gave to man the will to love me or to hate me or merely to disregard me. So I can promise you nothing. Your kind is used already for work, and the men who use you are neither markedly improved or disimproved by contact with you. But now a new age begins. Soon now you will be taken to be looked upon, to be regarded as strange and as wonderful, and forgive me, my dear ones, as funny. As I said, I'm not omnipotent. I can't even prophesy. I ask only this: be your own good selves, always faithfully, always in knowledge of my love and regard, and through so being, you may convert those heathen, those barbarians, where all else has failed. During this admonition and blessing, the oldest elephant sadly leaves the assembly and walks away to the great secret elephant cemetery and dies there. Soon after, men come among the elephants and capture them for circuses. We move then from fiction to fact. This is what happened, a matter of record, when elephants were brought among civilized men. 1824, the first American circus elephant. She was brought by a man whose headquarters was Somers, New York. She was called Old Bet. She was exhibited locally. In a small town in western Connecticut, religious people decided she was the reincarnation of Behemoth and shot her dead. She was buried at Somers. A statue was raised above her grave. Ever since, it's been a shrine for circus people. Then, late 19th century, Jumbo, the most famous and beloved of elephants. He died as follows. He was led across the railroad tracks to his private car. A gap was left in a long line of freight cars for his crossing. Except for this gap, the tracks were hemmed in by linked cars. This was at night. No train was scheduled, but an express came through. Jumbo, seeing it, remembered the gap and turned and ran for it. He ran so hard he overshot it. He turned again and met the locomotive head on. He was instantly killed. The locomotive was derailed. Next, 1916, Mary. In the small town of Irwin, Tennessee, out of what charming provocations you can imagine, Mary went berserk and killed 3 men. The general populace decided accordingly that she should be hanged. They strung her up on a railroad derrick. She broke it down by sheer weight. Then they built a stronger derrick. After 2 hours, Mary died, hanged by the neck while 5,000 oafs looked on. And in 1934, the grand finale, the greatest choreographer of his time, George Balanchine, instructs the greatest elephant corps of any time in ballet. The elephants are embarrassed but do their duty. The big night comes. They dance to music by Stravinsky in pink tutus. They do very nicely, hardly a mistake. But all through the performance, people roar with joy at their clumsiness and their dutifulness. The elephants are deeply shamed. Later that night, the wisest of them, extending his trunk, licks up a dying cigar butt and drops it in fresh straw. All 36 elephants die in the fire. Their huge souls, light as clouds, settle like doves in the great secret cemetery back in Africa. And then, perhaps God speaks tenderly again, perhaps saying, "The peace of God which passeth all understanding," etc. Well, almost nobody I've described it to likes the idea, except me. It has its weaknesses, but I like it. I hope you do. I must stop for now. My love to you, Jim. I'm going to sing a song for you I wrote. It was part of an arrangement with the University of Tennessee. They have an ongoing program called Boundless, Artists in the Archives. And they ask artists one at a time to come in, and it's actually an assignment. They direct you to a certain part of their special collections department and ask you to read certain papers, do some research, and then create whatever they're asking. In my case, it was a song, and the assignment had to do with James Agee. I had written a song that was somewhat about James Agee, and this was just last fall, and I thought I'd written a song for Agee that I had in me to write, and so I wasn't so keen on writing another one, but I wanted to do it. I wanted to take on the assignment, but I already had a particular new interest in James Agee, which had to do with the new publication of called A Death in the Family, a restoration of I think it's the restoration of the writer's, what is the name of it? Something like that. But what it amounted to, of course, when James Agee died, he was never aware of the book being published. And the editors, David McDowell, did an incredible job, certainly won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's a very, very beautiful book, and I'm sure most of you here are familiar with it. I grew up with it and was sort of connected to James Agee through my life. My dad worked at the L&N railroad station and would come home when they were filming all the way home and give us reports on what they did, the parts that they filmed in the rail yard there and so forth, and we actually went to the premiere that was here. So I had been taking notes on this restoration. I found it very interesting, the book. Not to go on about it, but it has a very strange introduction that Agee wrote, which was a dream he had. And he actually mentions St. John in the dream because he's going back in time, sort of. He finds himself, he doesn't know where he is at first. He thinks he might be in Chattanooga, but realizes he's in his hometown of Knoxville. And he walks down the street, and different, I won't get into it, but a lot of interesting things happen to him. And he notes some of the places that he remembers, and one of them is St. John's. But he has a different story. Michael LaFaro called it very different from the original version. Perhaps if you get a chance, you can read it. But the fact of the story itself is what interested me, and how stories may change. Maybe this was what James Agee would have published, maybe not. I love both versions very much. But the story is a thing. You could say all the great religions of the world are the greatest stories told. And so that aspect of story stuck with me, and I wrote an essay about the two versions, but along the same lines, the same subject, I wrote this song. I guess I could say it's a co-write with James Agee because I used some of his lines in it. Where does this story end? Where did it all begin? All those pages that we turn. What have we really learned? I saw it in a dream. childhood memory. It fades away so soon, like evening stars at noon. And those who've gone before, who walked along this shore, all those children of the sun, going back and back beyond, who lived in their time as I live now in mine. We rise and then we fall, like sparks upon a chimney wall, the story of the world. And did they tell you, did you hear, the world you know will disappear, but they can never, no, not ever, tell you who you are. He was working when the sun came up, coffee and bourbon in a cup. He wrote a letter to a friend, and then went back to work again, wrestling an angel through the night, drag that body into the light, no matter what the cost, to keep this morning watch and tell the story of the world. Night of the hunter, African queen, Knoxville summer 1915. We're talking now of summer evening, when I was a child. A father and a son, an evening walk back home, a favorite place they like to stop and sit together on a rock and listen to the night beneath the stars so bright. They'll sit a while and then they'll walk. No need to even talk to tell the story of the world. The story of the world.
Thanks, RB. I'd never heard that song before. This is one of the first audiences who's ever heard it, right? Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, thanks a lot. There's a lot more to the story of this place, but that's probably enough for tonight. And I bet you all want to get a beer or something now. But the history of a church goes on, especially this church. And when you come to the Big Ears Festival and see people like Bella Fleck playing up here for packed house full of people from around the world, you realize that this tradition is being carried forward in lots and lots of different ways. But But anyway, it's in some ways it's just a return to the days of Gustavus Knaba and Frank Nelson. But thanks very much. This has been a great pleasure to be here, a wonderful privilege to be here, and I appreciate it. And thanks to RB.
So as Jack said, we have plenty more food and beverage next door. We hope that you will linger. Jack and RB will be next door if you wish to ask questions or greet them. And we hope that you'll come or stick around for a little bit longer. There are also season brochures that will tell you about the other events that we have this year, and of course donation forms. A series like this is always dependent on your goodwill. So we invite you to visit that table as well on your way to the beer line, or maybe after the beer, either way. So thank you very much. Let's please greet again RB Morris and Jack Neely.
Wow, good job.
Good.
Good job.